In a remote ranch house in Montana, an old man stares into his webcam, remembering the best advice he ever had.
When I first met John, I didn't know what to think. He was loud, irreverent, disheveled, and he always had a cigar bouncing up and down in the front of his mouth.
Ray Leopold is wearing a purple baseball cap, plaid shirt, grey hair long from lockdown. He's in his 60s now, but when he talks about John Boyd, he's 20 years old.
He was supposed to be the world's best air-to-air combat pilot. These other people also told me that he was a madman, and everybody clearly tried to avoid him.
In 1973, Ray was a fighter pilot turned pen pusher at the Pentagon. John Boyd was his commanding officer. They were working on designs for a new generation of fighter aircraft.
He called me Tiger and kept telling me about the great things we were going to do. And then he'd elbow me in the ribs and rhetorically ask, right? Right, I didn't even know what he was talking about. But it sounded like he knew what he was talking about, so I kept listening, he kept talking.
For an ambitious young officer, working for John Boyd wasn't the best thing for career progression. Boyd had a way of making enemies in the strict hierarchy of the Pentagon. One day, he turned to Ray.
He looked me in the eye and said, Tiger, you've got to make a decision. To be or to do, that's the question. Which way are you going to go?
Boyd was a doer, all right, and what he did changed the course of history. My name's Matthew Side. Welcome to Sideways, my show exploring the ideas that shape our lives with stories of seeing the world differently. This week's episode is all about a US Air Force colonel called John Boyd, how he came up with a revolutionary theory of warfare, and what happened when that theory spread from military to business and eventually politics. Born in Pennsylvania in 1923, John Richard Boyd was straight out of central casting. He was your archetypal fighter pilot, the cigar, the buzz cut, the personality of a steamroller.
He smoked, and wherever he was, just had all this smoke around him. Listening to John Boyd was like trying to take a drink out of a fire hydrant. And I'd even seen him encounter general officers senior to him, and he'd have that cigar bouncing up and down in his mouth, and I twice saw him burn holes in the general's ties. They feared him. All they wanted to do is disengage.
He first saw action in the Korean War during the 50s. From there, he became an instructor at the Air Force's Elite Combat School in Nellis, Arizona. It was here that John Boyd made his name. He had a signature move that he would use in practice dogfights. First off, he would allow a rookie pilot to get behind him into a firing position, and then
he'd fly straight up until the plane totally lost airspeed and would start going backwards. Most of those guys were thinking of flying airplanes in two dimensions, front, back, left, and right. He folded into the tactics that he developed, the vertical dimension.
Boyd's plane would instantly slow down. The underside of the aircraft became a brake against the air. Before the rookie even knew what was happening, Boyd was behind him.
The way he'd describe it, and I heard him describe it many times, he'd talk about his jet aircraft. He said, I had fire coming out of the back, I had fire coming out of the front, and that guy just couldn't take it, and he fell off, and I got on him, and I shot that MS down.
Boyd called it flat plating the bird. He boasted that it meant he could beat any pilot in 40 seconds. He was pretty sure of himself.
He got to be known as 42nd Boyd. And, one of his friends told him, he said, hey, you always beat everybody in 20 seconds. Why do you make this bet, 40 seconds? His response was, well, someday something might go wrong, but it never did.
In the mid-60s, Boyd was promoted to Air Force headquarters at the Pentagon. He was working on the designs for a new generation of fighters, but it was during this time that he started to develop a new way of thinking about warfare.
There were other times when I'd walk around the Pentagon with him and I'd look down the hall. They'd see us coming, general officers. They'd turn around and go the other way. They did not want the encounter. We were supposed to be doing the development planning for the whole Air Force. And we wrote a report. And Boyd said, we always thought about things in terms of orient, decide, act. And we said, good. So we used that in this development planning report.
Orient, decide, act. That was the way Boyd taught pilots to behave in a dogfight. Orient yourself, decide what to do, and then act. And that was that. The report was filed. Ray Leopold moved on. But Boyd, he kept thinking about it.
Most of his phone calls would start, hey, Tiger, how you doing? Listen to this. Not that day. I answered, he said, there's another O. It's OODA. It's not ODA. There's another O. He said, you have to observe before you can orient. And he went on for at least 20 minutes before I said anything. That was him discovering the OODA Loop.
It's easy to get distracted by the acronym OODA. Observe, orient, decide, act. It's basically a decision cycle. But the essence of Boyd's idea is that in an adversarial situation, that cycle should be all about surprise, disorientation, throwing the enemy out of their stride. If you can get through your decision loop faster, if you can ensure that your opponent's plans are out of date even as they act, if you can bamboozle them as to what on earth you're up to, you have a critical advantage. This is what Boyd learned in his dogfights above the Arizona desert, and it is, in my view, a far subtler insight than it might appear. But don't take my word for it. Many historians today categorize Boyd with the likes of Sun Tzu as amongst the great military strategists of all time.
Colonel Boyd modified the blitzkrieg of World War II and added to it, and that became his theory of warfare.
Robert Coram is the author of Boyd, the fighter pilot who changed the art of war.
When Boyd first developed the theory, he and his friends were reluctant to make the OODA Loop public because it was a tool of such possible lethality and danger that it should not be in the open for everybody. But it was okay because most people don't understand it.
It is characteristic of Boyd, the great maverick, that he never published a book explaining his theory. The only form we have it in is a presentation from 1976 called Patterns of Conflict. The briefing is dense, detailed, and exceptionally long. Basically a 14-hour-long PowerPoint. But you perhaps won't be surprised to hear that Boyd never gave an abridged version. It was full brief or no brief. But here's one of those little wrinkles of history. One who was prepared to listen was a congressman by the name of Dick Cheney. The two men began to discuss how the US could conduct its next conflict. A few years later, Cheney got a chance to act on their ideas. In 1990, he became the US Secretary of Defense.
The Gulf crisis finally became the Gulf War at about 11:30 British time last night. Hundreds of Allied aircraft, American, British, Saudi Arabian and Kuwaiti, began a series of heavy bombing raids on targets in Iraq.
On the 2nd of August, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Less than a week later, American troops started arriving in Saudi Arabia ahead of an imminent counter-invasion. It was Dick Cheney who was running the show.
Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney had been one of Boyd's students when he was a congressman, and he called Colonel Boyd to the Pentagon, and they were going over Boyd's ideas about conflict.
The plan was to overpower the Iraqis with firepower and numbers, a straight invasion of Iraq. But there was a problem. The estimated number of casualties ran to over 100,000. Boyd argued for a different way. After hours of closed-door meetings, Cheney abandoned Plan A. There would be no direct assault on Iraq. In its place, the plan became pure Boyd. He focused on disorientation, on confusion, a left hook maneuver. The army would encircle Saddam's forces, cutting off their communication and supply lines. But this could only work if the Iraqis believed that the US forces were going to invade Kuwait. So the US Marines made a show of beach landing exercises. They placed an entire division off the coast. And sure enough, the Iraqis fell for the dummy. They committed troops to Kuwait. A huge section of Iraqi forces were neutralized without firing a single shot. The OODA strategy had worked.
It was Boyd's ideas that led to that swift, decisive victory in the Gulf. He was the driving force behind America's victory in the Gulf War. And I talked to Dick Cheney afterwards. He had retired then, and he told me all this, how much faith he had in Boyd and how much he relied on him.
Deception had been used before, of course, but Boyd's innovation was that deception should be integral to every decision cycle, constantly wrong-footing opponents. Speed was the key. Boyd's friends see the First Gulf War as his great triumph, but it came late in his life. He passed away in 1997. Boyd's funeral was a sorry affair. There was only one Air Force general in attendance. It looked like a snub for a colonel who had devoted his life to the military. Boyd did have a small group of devoted friends. They were determined to see his ideas passed on. Slowly, the OODA Loop theory began to grow in influence. It crossed into business schools as a framework for making strategic decisions. And as the idea spread, it came to Britain, and it reached the desk of another man obsessed with high-stakes decision-making, with conflict, with winning. He read Boyd's work in forensic detail, and until recently, he worked in Downing Street.
Your guy, Dominic Cummings, who, when he was appointed, he talked a lot about how much he relied on Colonel Boyd's ideas. I believe he understands it. I would like to meet him one day because he gets it.
I also wanted to meet Dominic Cummings for this program, but he didn't want to meet me, so I found someone almost as good.
I started working out in Vote Leave at the start of 2016, the referendum year.
Dr. Lee Rotherham had the title of Director of Special Projects.
In the space of a couple of weeks, I saw that there were some delays in the decision-making process, which is only natural because with any new campaign, there's always an element of confusion as to how things get signed off. And while explaining this to one of the top boards, I specifically explained it in terms of using John Boyd's theorem. And then that got passed on to Dominic, and then, judging by the results, it got taken note of because those logjams disappeared again.
So how did the Brexit campaign apply Boyd's ideas? Ahead of the referendum, Vote Leave built up a database of ready-made talking points and research. Dr. Rotherham says it gave them a head start on their OODA Loop.
What that meant was that for rapid rebuttals and for whenever a journalist rang up with a question, the points were already set out and explained, and it was basically able to cut and paste the response with detailed analysis and links and so on and so forth. So that meant that at least 2, possibly 3 parts of the OODA Loop at a moment in time, it was almost a cut and paste job to get to that point because all the prep work had done that in advance. And I think that was a critical feature of the Leave side's success.
Vote Leave had a genius for wrong-footing their opponents and, it's fair to say, everyone else. They came up with statistics that threw the entire campaign into confusion. One of those, classically, was £350 million a week for the NHS. They punched through the fog they had created with new slogans and statistics. They were fast, agile. They rebutted stories as soon as they had emerged. Remain were disorientated. It was pure OODA. A referendum campaign may seem a far cry from fighter pilots and flat-plating the bird, but it is indisputable that Boyd's ideas were influential at the very top of the Vote Leave campaign. Cummings explained this, in his own words, in a blog post that will, I think, go down in history.
As I've said many times, Vote Leave could only win because the establishment's OODA loops are broken, and they are systematically bad at decisions, and this created just enough space for us to win.
The OODA loop had helped Vote Leave win a referendum.
Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
But back in the military, OODA theory was facing an even stiffer challenge.
I was the senior intelligence officer for the 1st Cavalry Division, long time ago. And we used to go to the National Training Center. And at the National Training Center, the hardest mission for a unit was considered crossing an obstacle covered by fire.
Stephen Rotkoff is a retired Army colonel. To understand the limitations of the OODA concept, you have to understand the difference between two types of mission. Ones that are complicated and those that are complex. There's a training exercise that he used to do in his early days as an intelligence officer.
So the enemy has built obstacles, they have channeled you into those obstacles, they have direct and indirect fire on those obstacles. That's a very challenging mission. It is fundamentally a complicated mission. It's governed by physics and math. And we defeat that science with our science. You suppress the enemy's indirect fire, maybe with attack helicopters. You suppress the direct fire with eyes and fire. We have bombs that will detonate the minefields. And you cross the obstacle. It is about the maths of battle space. And OODA works very well.
Stephen calls this exercise a complicated mission. He thinks of them as a bit like a Rubik's Cube, technically hard, but with no unknown factors. For real-world problems like this, the OODA loop is great. You orient, observe, decide what to do, and act, repeating this until the mission is complete. But there's another type of problem, a complex problem. This is more like Monopoly. It has dice, random cards, and human opponents. No two games are ever the same. It just can't be gamed out like a Rubik's Cube. So in military terms, what does a complex mission look like?
Now let's take that same unit and put it in a city of 100,000 people. What's knowable there? Some guy's dog gets run over by a convoy yesterday, and he decides that he's going to plant an IED because he's pissed off. How do you predict that? Where are the maths of that? They don't exist.
Stephen, of course, is talking about the Second Iraq War. He was there in 2003 as a senior intelligence officer in the US Army and Marine Command. Dick Cheney had used John Boyd's ideas in 1991. Now, in 2003, OODA was riding again.
Baghdad tonight, under heavy bombardment on the day the war started. American and British troops are in action on land, sea, and in the air.
OODA Loop was taken to even further extremes around this idea that if you did the right kind of targeting, that you could collapse the enemy's center of gravity, eliminate his tactical advantage or his options or whatever. OODA, because it's an Air Force-derived concept, was designed really initially as a targeting method. The target in Boyd's original case really being dogfights. And mostly OODA's been applied to blowing things up.
Blowing things up is really useful during battles. And let's face it, the US Army is really good at blowing things up. But what happens then? When Saddam was dead and the Iraqi army was disbanded, the hardest part was supposed to be over. But that's not how it went. The US kept targeting insurgents, but the insurgents just kept coming.
OODA doesn't say much about determining root causes. You're observing, you're orienting, you're figuring out what you want to do, you're deciding and you're acting. But observing is really looking at the top of the iceberg. So in order to really deal with complex problems as opposed to complicated problems, you really have to understand root causes. We were not interested in root causes. We were interested in how are they targeting us? How do we clear those routes? That has nothing to do with why are they targeting us? Are all the people targeting us for the same reasons? I mean, that's a very complex, deep question. It's different than are we being targeted and what do we do about it?
This is, I think, an absolutely critical distinction. The OODA loop can help you defeat the enemy confronting you. You can confuse them. You can disorient them. You can blow them up. But if you don't address the underlying reasons for the conflict, it will simply re-emerge in new form. The OODA loop, in this sense, is inherently superficial, brilliant for winning battles, but feeble when it comes to winning the peace.
Our end state was always going to be the defeat of Saddam and then something that followed. That complex task is really, really hard to think about. And it requires a whole bunch of areas of knowledge that the military didn't have at its fingertips. It required understanding the tribes, the clans, the religious differences, the local cultures. It required lots and lots of deep information that was not traditionally military. And so what happened was we put most of our energy into the complicated tasks, and we said the complex tasks will be somebody else's problem. But there was no somebody else really to hand them off to.
Observe, orient, decide, act was found seriously wanting in Iraq. So how has it fared in Downing Street?
I think Dominic Cummings is clearly a man who thinks of almost everything as adversarial, as strategic, as oppositional. And the OODA Loops model is really built for that.
James Ball is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and a seasoned Westminster watcher.
Government isn't adversarial. You're trying to deliver services. You're trying to change stuff. I feel like actually government is quite plodding and quite boring. And in a lot of ways, if you're trying to run it in this way of trying to get inside OODA loops and disrupt them, you're committing a bit of a category error. And I don't think that's the fault of poor John Boyd or the idea of the OODA loop. I think it's, trying to repair a fridge with a tin opener.
Deploying the OODA loop in politics is to treat it like combat, like a competition. And there's no doubt about it, Dominic Cummings is a great campaigner and, yes, a winner. But he's always given the impression that he wants to bring about fundamental change. The question is, in amongst the chaos, did he manage it?
I think if you're running a campaign or if you're trying to run against opposition, this kind of chaotic, aggressive, disruptive way of communicating is fantastic. You've got everyone kind of clutching their pearls and going, well, you can't say that or you can't do that. And it keeps everyone sort of repeating your message. It keeps everyone off their game. Where it kind of goes wrong is if you're actually trying to, reassure the public or deliver a message or inspire trust or, heaven forbid, unite people. This sort of disruptive, chaotic method sort of doesn't work. Sometimes you actually want people to be inside their comfort zone and feeling reassured. And Dominic Cummings' style was never the one to do that.
I can't help thinking that in a political context, the limitations of the OODA loop are even more profound. In a campaign, as we've said, it's brilliant. Confusion is just what you want to throw opponents off their game. But in government, this logic flips. Governments don't want citizens or institutions to be constantly wrong-footed or disorientated. It's not a competition with them. They thrive on some degree of predictability and competence. It's not about picking fights, whether with the civil service, the judiciary, the media, or anyone else. In November 2020, Dominic Cummings himself span out of Downing Street, ousted from government after losing a power struggle and leaving the building with just a box of possessions. He was a genius-level campaigner. He deployed OODA theory with ruthless efficiency. But I can't help thinking that he was a victim of that very concept, seeking new fights within and beyond Downing Street, failing to recognise that a successful nation often needs consensus, not chaos.
I think it tells us a lot more that Dominic Cummings is fascinated and grabbed by the idea of OODA loops versus other ideas than actually looking at the philosophy itself would. I think the fact that this is the one that appeals to him is more telling than the philosophy itself. And he seems to be a man who thrives on conflict and thrives on chaos. And so isn't it quite nice to have a very esteemed Air Force figure of 20th century legend to be able to say, yeah, well, I'm following his strategy.
What's certain is that John Boyd was an original. Like Dominic Cummings, he made an indelible impression on history. The OODA Loop is as close as anything we have to a general theory of conflict. But life isn't just about conflict. Situations can be ambiguous, complex, and with the right approach, even mutually beneficial. John Boyd's life was a litany of falling outs. So perhaps it's fitting that, like a lot of very clever men, he never worked out the ultimate strategic game. The one called cooperation. Thanks to the producer of this episode, Robbie McInnes. Our series editor is Russell Finch. Sideways is produced by Novel for BBC Radio 4.